On October 1st, 2017, Stephen Paddock opened fire on a crowd that had gathered for a Las Vegas music festival. Paddock killed 58 people and injured hundreds more. Nearly a month later, on Halloween Day, Saifullah Saipov drove a rental truck down a New York City bike path, ramming a number of people before crashing into a school bus. Saipov killed 8 and injured 11. On November 5th, Devin Patrick Kelly headed to a church in Sutherland Springs, Texas, not to sing hymns or hear the sermon, but to slaughter Christians. As of this recording, 26 men, women, and children are confirmed dead. More are injured. Now, what if I told you that all 3 of these attacks were Islamic terrorist attacks? What if I told you that all modern mass killings, without exception, are Islamic terrorist attacks? Would you think that I've finally become a conspiracy theorist?
Illuminati.
Or would you eagerly lean forward in your seat, knowing from experience that even though it sounds absolutely insane to say that all modern mass killings are Islamic terrorist attacks, I'm nevertheless about to unleash such a brilliant and airtight volley of reasoning that anyone with a shred of common sense and integrity will, by the end of this video, agree with me completely. So, which is it going to be? Crazy conspiracy theory or irrefutable argument? Go ahead and type your prediction into the comments section before you hear me out. Then at the end, you can tell me if your expectations were met. I'll give you 5 seconds of my inquisitive eyebrow raise while you lock in your response. Now that your answers are locked in, if I were you, I'd fasten my seatbelt and put my safety helmet on, because this media coaster we've been riding on is about to fly off the rails. Let's start with the most obvious Islamic terrorist attack, the New York City Halloween bike path massacre. Saifullah Saipov, a devout Muslim, used the skills he honed as an Uber driver to offer the world Islam's latest example of vehicular jihad. ISIS explicitly called on Muslims to carry out vehicular attacks. Saipov was shouting Allahu Akbar during the attack. He left a note proclaiming his allegiance to ISIS. His phone was filled with ISIS propaganda. Later, in the hospital, he demanded that an ISIS flag be displayed in his room. So, why do we call this a terrorist attack? Is it because Saipov targeted a bunch of non-combatants in order to further the goals of his religious or political ideology, which is a pretty common definition of a terrorist attack? No, according to a number of vocal and popular propagandists, we only call this an Islamic terrorist attack because Saipov was brown. Dr. Craig Considine, a sociology professor at Rice University, tweeted this: posting not to fan the flames in Manhattan, but to highlight the important role that race plays in determining what is or isn't terrorism. Like everything Dr. Considine posts, this tweet is stupid on multiple levels. He actually tells his readers that Saifullah Saipov was labeled a terrorist because of the color of his skin, not because he targeted a bunch of non-combatants in order to further the goals of his religious or political ideology. Second, here's a picture of Saifullah Saipov next to Dr. Considine's color chart. Does Mr. Saipov's terrorist label confirm or disconfirm Dr. Considine's chart? Is he the color that qualifies one as a terrorist? Not at all. Saifullah Saipov in particular, and Uzbekis in general, are about as brown as I am. He's in the lightest category on the chart. So if Saipov isn't being called a terrorist because of the color of his skin, why is he being called a terrorist? Could the mysterious answer lie somewhere in the fact that Saipov committed a clear and indisputable act of terrorism in the name of Islam, making him an Islamic terrorist? You'd have to be a complete lunatic not to call this man a terrorist. And yet Dr. Craig Considine, who's teaching the next generation of sociologists at Rice, tells his followers that the real reason we call this man a terrorist is racism. But there's an obvious objection from the Considine camp here, namely that other people who've gone on killing sprees haven't been labeled terrorists. This brings us to the Las Vegas shooting. Notice that I said Las Vegas shooting and not Las Vegas terrorist attack. Why would I call it the Las Vegas shooting and not the Las Vegas terrorist attack? Well, terrorism has a specific definition. Terrorism is the use of violence or the threat of violence in pursuit of political, religious, or ideological change, usually excluding wartime violence, violence against enemy combatants, collateral damage, self-defense, and so on. Now, what political, religious, or ideological change was Paddock's attack meant to bring about? Exactly. Paddock didn't leave a manifesto or a note. He didn't post a video beforehand. He didn't proclaim his allegiance to a terrorist group. Friends and family had no clue what his motivations were. If you're investigating this attack or reporting on this attack, your initial reaction is to think, this looks like a terrorist attack. But when you can't find any indication that the attack was meant to reach some political or religious goal, you have to start thinking, either this guy is the worst terrorist in history, he forgot to tell people why he's killing, or he's not actually a terrorist, he's a mass murderer. You see, sometimes people just want to kill lots of other people. Sometimes they fantasize about it for years, and then they finally set a day and do what they've been dreaming of doing. They have no political or religious agenda in mind. They just want to feel the power of slaughtering people and ruining lives, knowing that they will always be remembered for the carnage they caused. Is that different from a terrorist attack? I don't see how it's any better than a terrorist attack, but it's clearly different. And that's why we don't call these kinds of attacks terrorist attacks. A terrorist attack is something different. So, is there a reason to distinguish between attacks that are meant to bring about ideological change and attacks that aren't meant to bring about ideological change? Of course there is. We need terms for different kinds of attacks so that we know what we're talking about. Words have meanings. But according to Islamic propagandists, the only reason we don't call Stephen Paddock a terrorist is that we're all racists. Hence, Qasim Rashid tweeted, Las Vegas is the worst mass shooting in U.S. history. Media and cops refuse to call it terrorism because the shooter is a white male. Hashtag, where was he radicalized? And Dr. Considine agrees completely. Question, why are white men like Stephen Paddock referred to as a shooter or lone wolf rather than terrorist? And he's even kind enough to give us his own definition of terrorism. What is terrorism, according to Rice University's own Dr. Craig Considine? It's a propaganda term used to manufacture anti-Muslim sentiment, which in turn justifies worldwide military adventures to extract resources from weaker Muslim-majority countries. The term terrorism is deployed only when Muslims commit violence. So the term terrorism is simply propaganda that we use to justify seizing the resources of Muslim-majority countries. We call Saifullah Saipov a terrorist, not because his attack is a textbook case of terrorism, but because he's from Uzbekistan and we want to invade Uzbekistan and take all their uranium. Keep in mind, parents send their kids to schools like Rice University to be educated by professors like Dr. Considine. Money well spent if they're trying to turn their kids into howling, screaming, sniveling lib drones incapable of being reasoned with, because reasoning with them would require the use of words, and they've been taught that using words that have actual definitions is racism. Moving on, the most recent attack was carried out by Devin Patrick Kelly. Kelly was a rabid atheist with a history of violent outbursts and mental health issues. He viciously beat animals, he beat his wife, and he was arrested for cracking her son's skull. He was placed in a mental hospital, but escaped. Kelly was obsessed with mocking Christians. People who knew him from high school said that they had to block him from Facebook because he wouldn't stop mocking Christians, telling them how stupid they were for believing in God. Now, obviously, when a violent, possibly mentally ill atheist guns down an entire church full of Christians, he's obviously a Christian, right? He's obviously a Christian if you're Qasim Rashid. Following the attacks, Rashid wasted no time repeatedly insisting that Devin Patrick Kelly was a devout Christian Bible teacher. He literally taught Bible study. The mainstream media won't mention his faith. Manhattan terrorist non-practicing and wholly ignorant to Islam, clearly Islamic. A white Bible teacher killed 26 Christians. The mainstream media won't ask about white-on-white crime. Does Bible radicalize? Where are moderate Christians? Imagine the hypocrisy to say an ignorant, non-practicing Muslim represents Islam, but a Bible teacher doesn't represent Christianity. Dr. Craig Considine couldn't agree more that reporters are being thoroughly hypocritical for not bringing this devout atheist's Christian beliefs into their reports. Taught Bible study, but of course, few will attribute this to Christianity. Imagine the responses if headline read, "Taught Quran class." When your name is Devin Kelly, this has nothing to do with Christianity. When your name is Muhammad, this has everything to do with Islam. Now, think about what Mr. Rashid and Dr. Considine are saying. They're saying, you reporters working for the mainstream media are total hypocrites because when a Muslim slaughters non-Muslims in the name of Islam while shouting Allahu Akbar after declaring allegiance to ISIS, you call it an Islamic attack. But when an atheist guns down Christians, you don't call it a Christian attack. Hypocrites. Are these guys really this stupid, or do they just know that their followers on Twitter are this stupid? Mr. Rashid and Dr. Considine are also upset that Devin Kelly hasn't been described as a terrorist. Have yet to see a single media outlet describe Devin Kelly as the terrorist he is. How is mass murdering 27 people not terrorism? Oh, right. Once again, if you want to know whether some mass killer should be placed in the terrorist category, just ask yourself, what political or religious change was this attack meant to bring about? If you can't find one, you don't know if it's a terrorist attack yet. Now, Devin Kelly was a rabid atheist. If police had found a note in his car saying, "I'm killing these Christians to send a message to all other Christians that religion will no longer be tolerated," then it would be a terrorist attack. However, if Kelly went on a killing spree because he hated Christians and he hated the church and he was angry with his mother-in-law, but his attack wasn't meant to terrorize any other part of the population in order to bring about some sort of ideological change, then it wouldn't be a terrorist attack. So until you know what the intent was, you don't know that it was a terrorist attack. I've waited several days for investigators to find a political or religious motive. No political or religious motive has emerged, so I can't call it a terrorist attack. How is this such a great mystery? The reasoning of Mr. Rashid and Dr. Considine seems to go something like this. This attack was an instance of mass killing. Terrorist attacks involve mass killing. Therefore, this attack was a terrorist attack. Notice that this reasoning has the same logical form as this attack was an instance of mass killing. Genocide involves mass killing. Therefore, this attack was genocide. And it has the same logical form as this cat is a mammal. Dogs are mammals. Therefore, this cat is a dog. Why don't we call all mass killings genocide? Because genocide means something more than mass killing. Similarly, terrorism means something more than mass killing. In fact, killing isn't even the main component. Calling in a hoax bomb threat can be an act of terrorism. The main component of terrorism is the motive. Without a certain kind of motive, you don't have terrorism. But this doesn't stop Dr. Considine from lamenting, and we won't see terrorism linked to Kelly because he didn't shout Allahu Akbar. It's never labeled terror for white extremists. Yes, he just said it's never labeled terror for white extremists. Journalists never call it terror when a white person does it. Let's look at an example. Anders Breivik is as white as a person can possibly be without a genetic mutation. So, because of his skin color, Breivik's attack was never called terror by the media, according to Dr. Craig Considine. This means, of course, that the BBC would never call Breivik's attacks the Norway terror attacks. The Independent would never call them terror attacks. Fox News would never call them terrorist attacks. RT would never call them the country's worst terror attack and would never refer to Breivik as a far-right terrorist. The Huffington Post would never call him Norwegian terrorist Anders Breivik. The Sun would never call him right-wing terrorist. The Telegraph would never call him far-right terrorist. The Metro would never call him Norwegian terrorist. The New York Times would never call him the right-wing Norwegian terrorist. Wikipedia would never call him a Norwegian far-right terrorist. CNN wouldn't dare call Breivik's attacks the Norwegian terrorist attacks, and the network certainly wouldn't go on to describe Breivik as a right-wing Christian extremist, especially since Breivik said that he is not and has never been a Christian, that he's an Odinist and prays to Odin, and that there are few things in the world as pathetic as Jesus and his message. What can we learn from this? Premise 1. If an attacker is white, then reporters will not call him a terrorist. This is true because Dr. Craig Considine said it. Premise 2. Reporters call Anders Breivik a terrorist. This is true because we just saw them do it over and over again. Conclusion: Anders Breivik is not white. This follows from Premise 1 and Premise 2 via modus tollens. Alternatively, we could reject Premise 1 and realize that Dr. Considine is a chronic liar and that reporters, investigators, and prosecutors generally apply the term terrorist in exactly the way they're supposed to apply it. Now, when someone on Twitter or Facebook says, "Why is it terrorism when a Muslim does it, but only a mass shooting when a white guy does it?" I usually think that the person just doesn't know what the definition of terrorism is. The person thinks that the word refers to any sort of mass killing regardless of the motive. But when Mr. Rashid or Dr. Considine claim that any mass killing should be labeled a terrorist attack regardless of the motive, I have to wonder, don't they know what the definition of terrorism is? Qasim Rashid is a lawyer. Was he asleep when they explained terrorism in law school? And we know that Dr. Considine is aware of the correct definition because he photoshopped his own definition into an actual dictionary entry. Here's the unphotoshopped version. It says that terrorism is the unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, in the pursuit of political aims. So these guys understand the distinction between a terrorist attack and a mass shooting that lacks a political or religious goal. Why do they claim that the only distinction here is race, when they know that the distinction is based on the definition of the crime and not on race? Well, Dr. Considine and Mr. Rashid also know that calling people racists, much like calling people Islamophobes, is an easy way to manipulate morons. And they know that if they put together a big enough mob, shouting racist, racist after every Islamic terrorist attack, the jellyfish who report the news will continue to submit to their demands. As the mindless mob continues to grow, the deafening chorus of insults and abuse will soon drown out all open, honest discussion of Islam. Critics will be silenced, and Islam will be able to advance unopposed. Now, is it just me, or are people like Dr. Craig Considine and Qasim Rashid using the Las Vegas shooting and the Sutherland Springs shooting to control the media and to silence critics of Islam? Is there a political and religious system that calls for critics of Islam to be silenced? Yes, it's called Islam. So even non-Islamic attacks are being used to bring about the kinds of changes demanded by Islam. Do you see where I'm going with this yet? As of this recording, investigators haven't found a political or religious motive behind the Las Vegas or Sutherland Springs shootings. But a political and religious motive has now been attached to them. The attacks weren't used by the attackers to further a religious or political agenda, but the attacks are being used by Dr. Craig Considine and Qasim Rashid to further their religious and political agendas. In other words, mass shootings that were not Islamic in themselves are nevertheless being used to silence critics of Islam, which is a key component of the Islamic agenda. Dr. Considine and Mr. Rashid supply the missing ideological component that transforms these attacks from mass shootings into attacks that are used to terrorize the population. Think about this. There are terrorist attacks carried out by jihadis. Let's call them first-order Islamic terrorist attacks. The goal of the jihadis is to strike fear into the population in order to clear the way for the advance of Islam. A jihadi who carries out such an attack is a first-order terrorist. But there are terrorist attacks and mass shootings that have nothing to do with Islam. After every one of these attacks, however, propagandists like Dr. Craig Considine and Qasim Rashid use the attacks to strike a different kind of fear into the population. Fear of being called a racist, fear of being called an Islamophobe. But the goal is still to clear the way for the advance of Islam. Since these attacks are distinct from first-order Islamic terrorist attacks and yet are still used for the same overarching purpose, we'll call them second-order Islamic terrorist attacks. And the person who uses the attacks to bring about certain Islamic goals will be a second-order terrorist. Notice that second-order Islamic terrorist attacks are usually more effective than first-order Islamic terrorist attacks. Anders Breivik was more effective in silencing critics of Islam than the 9/11 jihadis could ever hope to be. Even though that's not what Breivik intended, that's how his attack was used. Saifullah Saipov killed 8 people along a bike path. That scared some people. That spread some terror. But Stephen Paddock's mass shooting in Las Vegas and Devin Patrick Kelly's mass shooting in Sutherland Springs will be used for years by Islamic apologists. What? You're complaining about all of these Islamic terrorist attacks during Ramadan 2018? Don't you know that non-Muslims commit acts of terror too? Look at Devin Patrick Kelly, and Stephen Paddock before him, and Anders Breivik before him, and Timothy McVeigh before him. You're complaining about the more than 30,000 terrorist attacks that have been carried out in the name of Allah since the 9/11 attacks, when other groups have also launched attacks? You must be a racist, Islamophobic, hate-mongering bigot, and we're going to keep calling you a racist, Islamophobic, hate-mongering bigot until you get so sick of the abuse you'll finally keep your mouth shut. Brilliant strategy, isn't it? So there are 2 types of mass killings. There are first-order Islamic terrorist attacks which are carried out by jihadis striving to obey the clear commands of Allah and Muhammad to violently subjugate the world to the authority of Islam. And there are all other mass killings. But all of these other mass killings are now being used by second-order terrorists to silence critics of jihad terror, to silence critics of Islam, to silence critics of Islamic child marriage and honor killings and wife beating and so on. But silencing critics of all things Islamic is a core element of Sharia, which means that all mass killings, whether Islamic or non-Islamic, are now being used to further the spread of Islam. This is some sick stuff we're dealing with. The next terrorist attack that occurs will either be by a jihadi shouting Allahu Akbar, or it will be by someone else. If it's by a jihadi, it will benefit Islam. People will be more afraid of standing in the way of Islam. But even if it's not by a jihadi, it will still benefit Islam. It will be used to build a bigger mob for manipulating the media and for silencing critics of jihad. Hence, all modern mass killings are now Islamic terrorist attacks, either because they're carried out in the name of Allah or because they're co-opted by Islamic propagandists to silence critics in the name of Allah. So, what do you think? Have we reached a point in history when all mass violence will now be used to propagate Islam? Let me know what you think in the comments section. And let me know if this video has been the delusional ramblings of a conspiracy theorist or the airtight deductions of an insightful realist. If you liked the video, be sure to click the like button. If you'd like more on Qasim Rashid and Dr. Craig Considine, here are some additional videos. As always, if you haven't subscribed, don't leave without clicking the subscribe button. I'll send you off with a traditional Wood family benediction. If you're going to walk on thin ice, you might as well dance.